remember, this pituitary gland, that size of a pea, it's going to have that anterior portion and the posterior portion. The anterior portion, cellular. The posterior portion, nervous tissue. Therefore, the connection, however, to both the anterior and the posterior was to the hypothalamus. So yesterday we had looked at that anterior portion, and how many of those hormones did we say come from the anterior pituitary? 9. So now, just like we did yesterday, oh, and don't forget that the hypothalamus is for those stimulating, and then the anterior, the releasing, that sort of thing, okay? So now we're going to look at this hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland, the one that's going to be nervous tissue. So when we look at the structure, when you look at the structure of the hypothalamus, which is nervous tissue, yesterday we noted that it looks like it has that direct connection, because it does. That this looked like it was just simply this extension, and that's what it is. Now, if you remember this little stalk hanging down, we said it was that infundibulum. Over here, okay, do y'all remember that really huge term that we had? That hypothalamo-hypophysis? Okay. So this time, when we look at that posterior pituitary, that was my dean. Never mind. He's talking to someone. So, on this posterior side, we're going to have that connection from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary, however, only has the 2 hormones that it produces: the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. So those are those 2 hormones from the posterior pituitary. Now this time, however, the information that's going to make it from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary, this time, what does it look like the information is passing? How is the information getting passed this time?
Looks like it's just fusing through.
It's through those axons. Because if you look at the hypothalamus, it's kind of representing those cell bodies, and then the axon that moves into the posterior pituitary. So this time we've got the axons making their way to this region. When we begin to look at what we're going to find, the product that will get released from the posterior pituitary is going to go to its target tissues. If you remember, 4 neurons for this tissue, do you remember how an impulse, one of those action potentials, the action potentials could be either stimulatory or inhibitory. So the same thing is going to apply. These action potentials that are going to travel, they can be stimulatory or inhibitory. And they're trying to give us representation of how we're going to pass along that impulse into this tissue, into this area, this region. And they're trying to show us little chemicals being released. Because remember, if we're talking about nervous tissue, that chemical that gets released is a neurotransmitter. Is that correct? Well, now when we have the synapse that's going to take place, if the job of the pituitary gland is producing hormones, once it gets the information, the product that's going to form form, remember that term, neurohormone? Okay, so we're having just a different origin for the product. Also with the posterior pituitary, only two things are getting made, the ADH and the oxytocin. Now, those hormones that we're going to see, the ADH, the oxytocin, another difference that happens with these two hormones, in the posterior pituitary, the hormones can be stored. In other words, it can have storage of its products.
Why? So maybe just like there's a lack of it, it will have it.
Antidiuretic hormone is very specific. An antidiuretic hormone, when it's needed, we need it now. We can't wait for it to get registered, send the signal, have it made, and exit. So one of the things that will happen, it can store the hormone. We can't store a lot in the anterior.
Is it stored in the posterior or the hypothalamus?
It can be stored in the posterior.
Mm-hmm.
So, as we look at these hormones, let's look at antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Now, in your textbook, this is going to be page 636, or starting on page 636. Another term for the antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin. Have any of you ever heard of that? Ever known someone who might have high blood pressure and their medication is vasopressin? This is letting us know the action that drug is going to take on those kidneys. Okay? So, vasopressin, the job of this hormone, prevent large outputs of urine. Prevent large outputs of urine. The way that it's going to do that, it's going to constrict the blood vessels. And that, of course, is going to be in relationship to blood pressure that can be picked up. And then regulate for that information. So how is it that this information is picked up? How would the body know to either release ADH or not? In our body, when we look at the chemical makeup, the body is going to have receptors located throughout it that are going to have the ability to pick up certain information. One of those receptors is a baroreceptor. Can't remember if I've mentioned that before or not, but the baroreceptor, note where it's located and what it is. It's specialized neurons. The walls, atria of the heart, veins, carotid arteries, aortic arch. Their job, blood pressure. That's it. If vasopressin the ADH hormone, is going to work, one of the things that it reacts to is blood pressure. And this is blood pressure that is monitored internally by all of these receptors. Now, you don't know this yet, okay, because we haven't talked about the veins or the heart, the cardiovascular system. Blood pressure. Throughout every second of every minute of every day, 24/7, 365, 366 if it's a leap year, okay? Your blood pressure is being monitored. For the most part, you go, they tell you blood pressure norm 120/80. They actually like to see it a little bit lower, 110/70. But hey, the older you get, you have no option but for that blood pressure to go up, for the most part. Your blood pressure doesn't do this number and stay the 120/80 24/7. Your blood pressure is going to do this, up, down, up, down, up, down. It is the force on the vessels, on the arteries. Why is it important? Now, let's think about this one thing. Why is it important to monitor pressure on the arteries? All right, hold on. Rebecca, do what?
I said so they don't burst.
Okay, we definitely don't want them to burst. Morgan?
To get blood flow to the correct organs.
Make sure we've got proper blood. Well, let's rephrase that and say proper blood flow to the tissues. Okay? Now, let's look at the flip side of this. When the blood leaves the heart, it is under tremendous pressure. Okay, so when it leaves the heart, goes by way of that aortic arch and begins to move down your huge abdominal aorta, the first organs it's going to hit is your kidneys. You will be shocked when we get to that chapter how much blood flows through your kidneys per day. Now, if blood pressure is high, what is that going to do to pressure within the kidneys? That's going to be high for the kidneys, meaning the blood flow is going to be rough on the kidneys, okay? Kidneys' job, filtration, production of urine. Get rid of the waste, all right? So,
Doesn't it clean the blood too?
well, that's the filtration.
Oh, okay.
Right, it's going to filter the blood, and it has certain things that it wants to remove from the blood, some things it's going to want to return to the blood, and then the rest of it will hopefully become the urine. And there is a normal output of urine that should happen per day, okay? Now, the flip side, anti-diuretic hormone is for preventing large outputs of urine. So the target tissue of this ADH is what?
Kidneys.
Our kidneys.